As usual, if you enjoy my work, please consider supporting me on my Patreon or on my Buy Me a Coffee page. The links to both websites are in the description of this video. On Patreon, there will be a poll for the patrons deciding the subject of my next video in the coming days, so do not miss it. This video is a bit different than usual, since it is directly connected to my demographic deep dive of Russia. So if you haven't watched that one, please do that first. Under the Russian demographic deep dive, there was a vibrant debate about some of the claims I have made in that video, and many people, often from Russia, disagreed fully or partially with some of my claims. As my viewers know, I do not take your critique lightly. If someone disagrees with me and offers valid counter-arguments, I do think about them deeply and often try to explain myself better in the comment section. Some of the criticism of the Russian video was interesting and really made me think, which I did. And I have found intriguing new information that I will share with you in this video, where I will go through some of the critique. The first thing to mention is the critique that I have used the percentage of ethnic Russians in the whole population, 71% in 2021, and not among the people that declared ethnicity, 81% in 2021 census, to point out the decline of ethnic Russians within the Russian Federation. I noticed this discrepancy when making the video, but my reasoning went as follows. While the number of ethnic Russians within those that have declared ethnicity remains stable at 80% census after census since 2002, the number of ethnic Russians among the whole population keeps declining. There have been over 1.4 million more deaths than births in Russia between 2010 and 2021, a clear majority of which were ethnic Russians that are overrepresented among the older generations. Approximately 5.5 million people immigrated to Russia, the vast majority of them ethnically non-Russian. And very conservatively, since only the people that have officially unregistered their residence in Russia are counted, 3 million people have officially emigrated, with ethnic Russians almost certainly being overrepresented in this group, since they often live in the more educated, wealthy areas and possess more options to live and build a life for them elsewhere. I just do not see how it is mathematically possible for the number of ethnic Russians to stay stable, unless the Russian population as a whole declined proportionally, which it did not, or there were massive shifts in the ethnic identification of the other ethnicities, which also raises many questions. It just does not add up. And the explanation that millions of ethnic Russians just stopped declaring Russian ethnicity in the census also seemed strange to me. Why would that be? But Russians in the comments have claimed that this is precisely what has happened. So, I started to dig deeper into the information about the census itself, and boy is that a mess. There has been widespread criticism of the methodological shortcomings of the census to the point where it has been called by independent demographers, quote, the worst census not just in the country's history, but maybe in world history too, end of quote. Maybe it was not a census, but a special demographic operation. There were strange spikes in certain age categories of the population and limitations resulting from conducting the census during the pandemic. According to a survey carried out by Levada Center, 42% of respondents reported not having taken part in the census, with this figure reaching 73% in Moscow. If these numbers were true, it would mean that up to 57 million people did not participate in the census. The census lacks ethnicity data for over 16.3 million people, which is nearly 12% of the total population. For comparison, this figure was less than 4% for the 2010 census. Among some non-Russian ethnicities, there have been suspiciously sharp population declines. For example, the number of ethnic Tatars, the country's largest ethnic minority, fell by nearly 600,000 people. The Mari ethnic group declined by 22.6%. The Chuvash population fell by 25%, and the number of Udmurts declined by 30%. Since the natural decrease cannot account for such declines, the only option is that the people change their declaratory ethnicity to Russian, some other ethnicity, or did not include any ethnicity at all. Such rates of change in ethnic identification in 10 years would be suspicious at best. In some regions, for example Chechnya, 100% of people declared their ethnicity, which is pretty fishy, and there likely have been some shenanigans and overcounting going on. In contrast, in the Komi region, 22% did not provide any ethnicity. When I looked into the criticism of the methodology, I found some voices saying that since the people that did not include ethnicity were disproportionately urbanized, and since urban centers are more ethnically Russian than the rest of the country, the number of ethnic Russians was heavily undercounted. The former Minister for Nationality Affairs and head of the Moscow Institute of Ethnography and Anthropology, Valery Tishkov, says that ethnic Russians were significantly undercounted in the 2021 census, with their actual number being over 13 million more than reported. That would put their real numbers close to 119 million, which is 8 million more than in the 2010 census and similar to the number in the 1989 census. Mr. Tishkov would have to explain to me how an ethnic group with subreplacement fertility and strongly negative migration rate can grow by 8 million in a decade. That is some voodoo shit. The only option is, again, a truly massive shift in ethnic identification of people that have identified as non-Russian in 2010 to identifying as ethnic Russians in 2020. While that might happen with some groups, for example Ukrainians or Russian from Kazakhstan previously identifying as Kazakhs, it is not very likely on such a scale. And I have found many more voices pointing out the dubious practices of the census takers that automatically filled in Russian ethnicity unless explicitly stopped from doing so, were instructed to fill in Russian ethnicity in case of uncertainty, or straight out falsified the results. It is also important to note that Crimea was annexed in 2014 and was included in the census, which could level off some of the declines in the number of ethnic Russians as a whole, since circa 2/3 of the 2 million inhabitants of Crimea are ethnic Russians. But the truly huge elephant in the room is emigration. As I said, only the people that have unregistered from their place of residence before leaving the country are counted as gone. For the most part, these are highly educated and skilled people. In particular, it is estimated that 200,000 scientists leave Russia every year. It is widely believed that the real volume of emigration is 3 to 4 times higher than shown by official data. That means that in reality, not 3, but between 9 and 12 million people might have emigrated. That would massively change both the population and the ethnic composition of Russia. The only conclusion we can make from all this information is that we do not have any concrete idea about the real ethnic composition, as well as much other demographic information of Russia. I should have done this research before making the first video and include all this information, and I apologize for that. But at the same time, this cannot by no means be interpreted as a confirmation of the percentage of ethnic Russians among people that have declared ethnicity presented by the census as a true percentage of ethnic Russians within the country. It might be higher than the 71% figure, but I would be very surprised if it is not lower than the 81% figure, and I would personally bet on it being closer to the lower end of the spectrum. In a country like Russia, with large internal demographic dynamism manifesting in massive simultaneous immigration and emigration, as well as significant diversity in the reproductive behavior of different ethnic groups, the stability of ethnic composition presented by the Russian censuses is highly suspicious. And if we lack credible data, one cannot avoid the question of what kinds of results Russian leadership would like to present. I think the majority of people, even those who might have sympathies for Russia or are Russian themselves, would agree that Russia is an autocracy, where official information sources are regulated in one way or the other. Censuses and ethnic data are, and also have been, highly political affairs. If that is the case, and we look beyond bad methodology stemming from simple incompetence, would Russian leadership prefer to present a more or less stable position of the Russian ethnicity within Russia, or its decline? I leave the answer to each of you. Whatever the reality is, the census took place before the largest natural population decrease since World War II of more than 1 million people happened in 2021, and before the invasion of Ukraine resulted in close to an additional million people leaving Russia and likely hundreds of thousands of Russian men killed in the combat. The real numbers on population and ethnicity in Russia would be of great interest to me, but we can only guess. The other criticism, which is nevertheless also connected to the census, is that I do not understand the relationship of Russians to ethnicity. That differs from the Western understanding that allegedly fetishizes ethnicity as the main reference point of one's worldviews and loyalties. In Russia, you might be ethnic Russian, Tuvan, Tatar, or Bashkir. Still, you are first and foremost Russian in the pan-ethnic and civilizational sense of the word, as is shown by the different terms that the Russian language has for these two categories. While I agree that the Russian relationship with ethnicity certainly has its specifics, and the situation of the minorities living for centuries within the Russian state cannot be compared to the ethnic minorities living in Europe created by recent immigration, I would be very careful before dismissing ethnicity as an important factor in analyzing Russian society. Ethnicity might be more or less important at different times and places, and its importance might manifest differently. Sometimes it can be cranked up and become a hostile, aggressive force, destabilizing states from within, as was the case in Yugoslavia. Sometimes it can be a rather mellow complementation of the variety of factors influencing the lens through which one sees the world, as in Switzerland. But it matters nonetheless. Maybe not always on the individual level, but definitely on the populational level. That is why there is such a fuss about the census ethnic results. In the first video, I already spoke about the vast differences between words and actions the Russian state executed during the Tsarist and Soviet times regarding different ethnic groups, while the facade of pan-ethnic identity was maintained both times. Various policies were implemented that implicitly showcased the leaning of both states on the Russian ethnic majority, perceived as the backbone of the imperial projects. The cultural Russification of the native non-Russian populations by diminished access to native education and literature, population transfers of ethnic Russians to peripheries as long as the population growth of the ethnic Russian allowed so, to establish more firm foothold in the regions, or the massive overrepresentation of Eastern Slavic ethnicities among the leadership of the Soviet Union as well as the Soviet generality, were all present in abundance. I do not say that the Russian state is racist towards its minorities, which it is not, and its efforts to build pan-ethnic identity might be genuine, or that loyalty to the state is primarily defined by ethnic criteria, which would also be very reductive. But I am also not entirely convinced that the presented reality of pan-ethnic Russian identity is as firm as many people claim it is. And a lot will be shown in the following years when the Russian state will be affected both by economic and geopolitical decline and the weakening position of its leadership, as was demonstrated by the recent Wagner's Group Curious March on Moscow. Deeds count more than words, and I will judge this issue by the actions people will take in the worsening environment in the Russian Federation. These potential frictions would not be clear-cut. It is naive to think that minority populations would behave as a monolith, especially as highly diverse minority population as the Russian one. In the case of significant destabilization, it is likely that some of the 200 ethnic groups in Russia would support the state, different might turn against it, and most would likely be split within and stand on the different sides. Some minorities are urbanized and splintered within regions with a large Russian majority. Others are concentrated in peripheral ethnic republics. Some regions might feel like their well-being is closely connected to Moscow, and some might see an opportunity for a higher level of autonomy or even a separation. An interesting takeaway from the 2021 census, even though we established it might not mean much, is that different ethnic republics are slowly becoming more monoethnic, since ethnic Russians living there are moving out to the more ethnically Russian regions, which might also increase the differences in time. A similar process was happening in the non-Russian Soviet republics in the 1980s, although likely for different reasons. But the large ethnic diversity and the complicated history of different ethnicities with the Russian rule adds to the overall complexity and unpredictability of the internal tapestry of the Russian Federation, and thus makes it more prone to destabilization than would otherwise be the case, especially in the volatile times it will inevitably go through in the near future. That is all for today. I was also thinking about including the many accusations of anti-Russian propaganda after I used the examples of preferential mobilization of ethnic minorities from the poor peripheries and of forceful separation of Ukrainian children from their parents for adoption by Russian families. Still, I decided not to do that, since that is not an issue suited for a substantial debate, but more a question of the credibility of one's information sources, and that is mostly a futile exercise, since the informational barrier between people supporting Russia and people supporting Ukraine in this war is almost impenetrable. Let me know if this shorter format suits you. I might then do it more often between the regular long format videos, for example explaining in depth some demographic terms or some other less extensive subjects.